Hi, I'm Todd Landry, Director of the Office of Child and Family Services for the state of Maine, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar. We're looking forward to presenting you with some information that we think is very valuable to all of our combined work in supporting Maine children and families, particularly in the area of childcare and early care and education. Some of you may remember that in 2020, we released, in partnership with the Bipartisan Policy Center, a landscape mapping exercise regarding the supply and the demand gap of childcare in the state of Maine. That information was incredibly valuable to us because it helped set the stage for where we had supply of childcare and where we had more demand than supply of childcare across the state. We had some great, interesting pieces of information that came about as a result of that analysis. Over the past 2 years, we know the challenges that here in Maine that we have faced with the COVID pandemic, and that has been faced, of course, across the entire country. That has been a significant challenge in some cases for child care providers and for child care systems. So one of the things that we wanted to do was reach out again to the Bipartisan Policy Center to do a renewal of that data so that we could get a new look, an updated look on where we stand on supply and demand of childcare in the state of Maine. Now, you may remember that when we did this exercise back in 2019 data and we released it in 2020, one of the things that we did was we used that data, and it was incredibly valuable to us over the course of the next 2 years, particularly from the scope of the pandemic. We used the plan, for example, to look at how we wanted to invest in infrastructure grants. And we specifically used this data to give more points to applications in those infrastructure grants that came from those areas with larger supply-demand gaps. The data that we got in 2020 also guided the development of our infant toddler stipend and other incentives related to childcare. Now, with this new and updated information, it gives us a chance to look at our childcare infrastructure and supply and demand in our state, now both pre-pandemic as well as we now recover from the pandemic. That information has been very valuable to us in the past, and we know it will be valuable to us as we move forward in the future. It's going to help us analyze the effectiveness of some of our COVID recovery and responses, and at the same time, we plan to use this data to set new goals as we move forward to completely closing our supply and demand gap in the state of Maine. Now, we are so happy to be able to partner with the Bipartisan Policy Center, and we are so appreciative of their work in this area. I'm joined today by two of our colleagues from the Bipartisan Policy Center, and it's my pleasure to introduce them to you now. First, my good friend and colleague, Linda Smith. Linda is the Director of Early Childhood Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. She'll tell you more about BPC, as we like to call it, but it is a Washington-based think tank that promotes bipartisanship and actively works to find consensus and common ground on key challenges facing the nation, including in the area of childcare. Linda is an incredible advocate for childcare in the country and is seen across the nation as one of our leading thought partners in how to improve the childcare landscape in the United States. We're also joined by Anubhav Bagley. Anubhav is the Regional Analytics Director at the Maricopa Association of Governments. He also serves on the Early Literacy Advisory Board for Read On Arizona. And currently, Anubhav is consulting with BPC in the development of a unique spatial analysis and mapping technique to model the need for childcare for each state. We're really delighted to be able to work with Linda, Anubhav, and in this analysis. I also want to give a special thank you to our OCFS staff who have done great work in partnering with BPC on this analysis, which I think is going to be invaluable for us moving forward in the future. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Linda and Anubhav so that they can take us through what they found in this updated analysis. And then at the end of their presentation, we'll have a chance to ask a few more questions as we begin to now use this analysis to guide our work in the future. Linda, Anubhav, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Todd, for having us. And I have to start out this conversation by thanking both Todd and Crystal in the state of Maine for being a part of this project from the very beginning. They were part of the advisory committee that started this work with us several years ago and provided invaluable information, support, and guidance to us as we got started in looking at this. So thank you to everyone up there in the state of Maine. As was said, the Washington, D.C. or BPC is a Washington, D.C. based think tank. And I think it's important to understand what we're trying to do when it comes to early childhood and childcare in the United States. Our goal is to understand how we can better finance the early childcare system in this country. We know we have huge gaps in between what it costs to produce care and the amount of care we have available. Some of that is because we simply don't know how much we need. And I think one of the things that in order to get our heads around sort of what does it cost, we had to know how much we need. And so we set out to do this assessment. And it's been a real journey. And I think both Todd and Crystal and Anubhav will all support this when I say it's been, we've, I think, closed the gap on the knowledge that we have about this. There's still more to do. And I think that will come out in this look at Maine's data. So let's go to the first slide, Anubhav, if we can, and then I want to walk you through an overview of what we've been doing. And I will want to stress a few things that I think are important for our audience to know, and that is that we use our everything that we have. We can cite the where the databases that they come from, and I'll explain that in a minute. But it's pretty important that we have accurate data, and where we don't have it, that we understand what those gaps are. So we started out by looking at the general need for care. You can go to the next slide. There we go. So what we started out looking at is just how many children potentially need care. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the potential need and what we mean by that. But it's important that your audience understand that there's a difference between the potential need and the actual demand, and we'll talk about that. But in looking at the census data, which was the database we used for this, there are over 15 million children under the age of 6 in this country with all available parents in the workforce, and that we need to stress that. So they either have both parents working, or if they live in a single parent home, the parent is working. And so that was our start point on this. So those children potentially need some kind of childcare while their parents are working. So what we then did was to look at sort of by state basis, where are these children, and then to map that against the supply in the communities. And so that was how we ended up, and Anubhav is going to talk you through our mapping, or our gap analysis, and how we did that with distance learning here in a second. But our goal was to have a baseline that we could use to build off of in this country, to know how much do we need, and then how and where are we making progress, where are we falling behind. And this then would give policymakers a tool to help them understand what's needed out there. And so we're well into that. And I would say to you now that we've mapped 35 states, and are in the process of 2 more right now, of the 50. And we did do a pause and a halt because of COVID, and the data was really sketchy during the early years of COVID. So that did put us in a pause mode. But in any event, what we were trying to do here is to build that foundation and that baseline to know where we're going from here. And it's noted that down at the bottom of this slide, you'll see what we included in our definition of childcare. And I need to stress, what it doesn't say is that we, as a part of the advisory committee, decided to use all childcare that is legally operating in the state. So just note that if it's legal, sometimes that's different than licensed. And so that's a point for people to know. Okay, if you want to go on to the next one, the next slide. So in looking at the sources of data that we used, obviously the state data, as I said, on childcare facilities and capacities, and we usually get the question, and yes, it includes family childcare and license exempt care that the state has in their databases. Obviously, we use the Census Bureau. And then we got from the Departments of Health and Human Services and the Department of Defense the data on Head Start programs, which are included in our data, as well as the Department of Defense, where they have installations and their capacity. So those are in there. The shortcoming in the data that we have right now are Native American communities. If there's programs on reservations, we don't necessarily always have those in our databases. So we looked at, as I said earlier, the potential need based on the census data, the supply based on the state databases, and that determined the gap that we have. And that's where Anubhav comes in, because we use a distance methodology, and he'll explain that to you in just a second. But it is different than some of the maps that you've seen when it comes to the desert work. And I think Anubhav has the best example of why the deserts don't always work, and that is in Arizona. If you look at the map, Sun City, Arizona, if you know what that is a huge retirement community in Arizona, shows as a childcare desert. Well, obviously, there isn't a real need for childcare there either. So the mapping methodology, I think, has served us well. So Anubhav, do you want to explain this to our audience?
Thanks, Linda. I'll switch the slide over. So yes, first of all, before I start, I do have to thank Todd, Crystal, and the team for all the data that they've been providing us, and this has just been a great partnership. The methodology we created was something very custom. We created some special models for doing this analysis, and particularly for Maine, we actually conducted additional analysis to understand how much distance are parents and children traveling to get to childcare facilities. The first question actually was, are parents traveling closer to work or closer to home? And BPC had run a number of surveys, and we cleared that it was the preference in the parents was closer to home rather than closer to work. But the other piece we were able to do is looking at custom data from Maine, we were able to understand that in general, in urban areas, parents and children were traveling about 3.5 miles. And in rural areas, they were traveling about 7.5 miles, given the existing data. We actually rechecked this before and after the pandemic, and that distance hadn't quite changed. So that was quite heartening. The way the method works is multiple steps. First of all, we take census data by block group to understand what is the potential need. So children under 6 with parents in the workforce was the potential need piece. We look at that. Then within that block group, we look at a distance, whether that is the 3.5 mile distance or 7.5 mile distance, depending on the area. We look at what is the available capacity. This piece we do across the board against all block groups, all census geographies in the state. That gets us these overlapping distance circles across the board. That's when we start assigning the children to the spaces, and that gets us additionally at the end, it gets us the gap. What this methodology does is makes us really look at where is the potential need, where is the capacity. You are not constrained to just looking at that block group and saying, no, you cannot cross the street across the block group and you still have to stay within that. Or the pitfalls of looking at, well, there is no need in this particular area, and then we're saying there is no facility there, and those are kind of pitfalls that we avoid. So this methodology has really worked. We've tested with a number of states, and that works. Back to you, Linda, on some more definitions.
Okay. Well, as I said earlier, we talked a little bit about the potential need, and and then how we got to that. What's the other factor in this, and is what is the demand? these children, the 66+% of children who need care, not all of those parents are ever going to ask for care. They make other arrangements. They may use a relative. They may, do shift work around their work patterns, etc. So what we have really come to understand and work hard at getting more information on is this demand. And that's the rate at which parents and families will actually use the formal childcare system. And we know and have come to understand a lot of what some of these variables are. Obviously, there are issues with cost and availability and whether it's there or not, etc. Hours of operation. So that impact whether a parent can actually use the system. So what we've been trying to do, and what happened in one of the first surveys that we did, was to try to understand, do parents want childcare closer to home or closer to work? We did national surveys. We found, generally speaking, 2 to 1, they want care closer to home. And we think this might be changing with the new work patterns that are out there as a result of COVID. But another thing, this is something that before we move forward with the Maine data, and you're going to see that Maine has closed the gap in some ways. The closer we get to a goal, the more we need to understand demand in a state. And there's no way to get that until, unless and until the state does it. So I would, one of the things that we recommend to Maine and other states are to begin to look at how you are going to capture your parents' actual demand or their preferences for childcare. And I think that comes at the state level, and to a certain extent, it comes at the local level. I tell a story, and I'm going to stop and tell it here because I think it's interesting, and it illustrates the point that we're trying to make. In speaking to counties in the state of Nebraska, maybe a year or so ago, in Nebraska, 2 counties side by side. One county had a plant that worked 24 hours a day. They needed one type of childcare. The county next to it didn't have that. So they don't need the 24-hour, the extended hours. The only way to know that is if you really engage at the local level with people, because there's no way at the national level we can figure that out. So we've done a lot of surveys, and I would encourage people to go to our website and look at them. We've now done, I think, a total of 11 national surveys trying to understand parents' needs and parents' what their preferences are. So I think if we can move forward with the next, we're going to look a little bit more into the analysis of what Maine has done. So you can keep going. Here we go now. Here's what we found in the most recent update of the Maine data. And again, children under 6 with parents in the labor force. You see that the potential need for Maine is 52,138. That's actually a decrease since we did the 2020 work. And that decrease is primarily in the urban areas. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, now this looks at the main providers. And again, we saw a change. And I think we've been trying to understand this a little bit better. I can tell you a little bit about what we're seeing nationally, just anecdotally, okay? But here you see where we've actually seen a decrease in the actual numbers of childcare programs in the state, but an increase in the capacity. And we are seeing similar trends, or at least hearing about, I should say, similar trends nationally, where smaller programs are going out of business and being, we think, bought out by bigger operations. And that this is a question for Maine, only, but that's what we're seeing elsewhere in the country, that we're losing smaller providers. But your actual number of facilities in Maine has decreased by 280, and that's about a 10% decline, which is consistent with what we've been seeing elsewhere. So I think in terms of this data, the largest declines in Maine were in the license exempt category and in the family childcare programs. Again, consistent with what we're seeing and hearing nationally on that front. We are hearing that a lot of family childcare providers are aging out of the program, retiring, et cetera, and that we're going to have to take a look at how we build capacity in the family childcare programs. So if we can go on to the next. Here we go. So this leaves you with a total gap in Maine of 3,251. This is again using the distance methodology and a decline in the gap. So you could say decline, but this is actually good news for Maine. I mean, it looks like you're filling more of your unmet need for care in the state. Again, it's shown by rural versus urban. The gap obviously is bigger in the rural parts of the state. That is not inconsistent with other states similar to Maine and primarily in the Rocky Mountain states. But again, you're getting closer to filling the need for care in the state of Maine, which is good news. Next slide. As many of you know, we have been breaking down the data a number of different ways. And so we look at things like counties, congressional districts, and you're going to see these. This one is the first, and it shows the potential need versus the gap in your counties in the state. Again, the light blue are the number of children under 6, and then the dark blue shows the gap. I hope I'm going to say this right. Aroostook County is obviously the biggest gap. Penobscot, York, and Waldo counties following that. So I think that moving forward, looking at exactly where you have those gaps and pinpointing the sort of where the need is, and then looking again, making a probably unsolicited recommendation here, but looking at parent preference in particular in those particular locations, I think would be very helpful. So let's go to the next slide. And the next one looks at the federal congressional districts. And I know that this one is a little tricky. We had to do a special custom analysis on this because the data is not yet been released by congressional districts from the Census Bureau. But Anubhav and his staff have taken a look at this and done some custom work to see if we could get that data for you. This may change a little bit when we get the actual data, which is due, I think, in the summer, this next summer. So that shows by congressional district. And we here in Washington do use this when we do visits to the various staff offices here in Washington. This particular analysis is very helpful. Congressmen are always interested in sort of what's going on in their district. So the next analysis that we did was looking at your state Senate districts. And they're shown here in terms of where the gap is. There is a gap in every district, but it varies greatly, depending on where. So anywhere from the 19th district, and I'm not completely familiar with where all these are, but up to the 2nd district, as you see. Again, in some of these places, in 16 of the districts that are not shown here, the gap is less than 20. So we did not put it on the map here. So the next chart shows you by state House districts what they look like. Again, we did the same thing here, showing where the gap was the biggest. And in the remaining state House districts, the gap is less than 20. So these are all actually very good news for Maine, because you're able to, it should be fairly, well, never say easy, but let's say it's not insurmountable in some of these smaller districts. Again, let's go to the gap. And I think we have the counties Okay, and they're right there, again, showing where the gap is by number. The next chart shows the opportunity zones, which we have looked at in all of the states. That work happened because of what happened with passing some of tax incentives to see what was going on in some of these districts with challenges in terms of some of the economic issues. We can go on to the next one, the urban areas, the larger urban areas versus the, we analyzed what we could of those, and you're going to see those in the next 4 slides where we show Bangor, Portland, Lewiston, and Augusta areas. So do you want to go to the Bangor area? That's shown here, and the heat map is there. If you look at the change, we put the change from 2020 to current, and the potential need has gone down, and that's because of capacity increases in that area. So your gap is less in the Bangor, Maine area. Go on to the next slide. Now this looks at the Portland area. The capacity versus the potential need gap, again at 357. Again, these are manageable numbers when it comes to, looking at how you begin to build the capacity in these areas. And the final one, go on to the, okay, so now I want to look at the limitations and conclusions, and possibly, think about with you where you go from here, because I do think we're very close in some areas, and the limitations on this now become even more critical. Because I always say to people, the closer you get to a goal, the more precise you need to be. And I think that is particularly true when it comes to this need issue. So what we don't know becomes almost as important as what we do know. So the limitations on what we have shown you today is, again, it's limited to the potential need versus the supply. And it does not take into consideration the parent choice and preference issues. And this is where we would make strong recommendations to the state to, especially in those areas where you have high numbers, to get, to do more around meeting with parent focus groups, parent surveys, to understand what's going on there, because we know from our work nationally that a significant percentage of parents will never want to use the formal system. So how does that factor into this unmet need? It's going to become a challenge for Maine, and I think, fairly quickly here. Again, the data is strictly based on license capacity, and we know that there are issues between the actual enrollment but we don't have that data, and especially when it comes to age of children. And again, accounting for the unmet need, it could be that all of the children in these communities are infants and toddlers, but we don't know that. And I think this is, again, a recommendation to the state to try to begin to get your arms around enrollment of your programs by age of children, and where do you have the gaps in that. Overall, I think these things work to a certain point, and then it's just really it's local. It really depends on the local issues. So again, going through this, you see what we've looked at. We've decreased the potential need in this, or you have in the state. The changes in the facility and the facility count. It might be interesting for Maine to think about, especially because of the loss in the family child care area and the subsidy area, to think about why that is and what we do about it. But I think in conclusion, I would applaud Maine for all of the work that they've done, not just with us, but over the last few years, in trying to understand this issue in the state, because it gives you so much more to go to budgeteers and to people to help, with helping us sort out okay, how do we go with, where do we go now with this gap? And what does it really mean to a state? So I'm going to say thank you once again to the state of Maine and the staff. They have just been super in terms of working with us and giving us information and going back and reviewing things. So thank you, Todd, and to your whole staff, and I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Really appreciate it. And my thanks also to Anubhav for all of your diligent work on the data side. Anubhav told me that as far as a bio goes, he preferred me just to call him a data geek. And so, Anubhav, let me just say thank you for being a data geek, because we need that so much so we have accurate information analysis that we can begin to turn into action. So, Linda, I did have just a couple of questions I wanted to follow up with you on for the benefit of today's webinar. You know, one of the things that we rely on BPC so much for is the fact that one, you're bipartisan and unbiased from that perspective. But the other thing that you do, of course, is you work across all of our states and jurisdictions in the country. Can you help us a little bit by putting some of this into context as it relates to comparing or contrasting Maine to the rest of the country? I know just recently BPC released a report on early childhood education and ECE governance structures across the country, and it was very helpful to see how the different states compare, because there is so much variability, of course, in that. If you're interested in that, that's available on BPC's website, of course. But as it relates to the supply-demand analysis, you've mentioned that you've done the initial work in about 35 states. We're one of the first to go through a second round of this analysis. What are some of your key takeaways and some of the highlights of how Maine compares versus some other states in the country as you've looked at this supply-demand analysis perspective?
Well, I think the first thing when it comes to evaluating the states, we haven't done that many to draw a lot of conclusions from. Okay, but we've done on the state, whether the capacity has gone up or down, whether the gap has gone up or down. But I do think Maine compares very favorably, and I would say that very favorably, when it comes to the size of your gap compared to most of the other states. And I think that's a real credit to the state. And I can't say that enough in terms of what you know about your providers, how where they are, etc. So I think, and Anubhav might back me up on this one, I think in the 35 states that we've done, the gap is somewhere around 31, 32%, and yours is nowhere as close to that. So you're really ahead of the game on that. And I do think that that's, again, in part because of your paying attention to this, and I think this, since we've started working with this state, there's been, a serious consideration to what we're learning from this. And sometimes it's do the work and put it on the shelf, and that's not been the case with Maine. And Anubhav, what would you add in terms of the 5 states? Because we've done 5 states remapping, and as I said, we don't see trends. But Anubhav, is there anything you'd add to that?
So one Maine's gap overall and percentage gap in the first set of 35 states, I would say, was in the lower quintile, the lower end, you already were doing very well in terms of providing childcare and having a lower gap. Of the 5 states that we've done, we noticed certain states actually the gap went up, and which was kind of coming out of COVID, the pandemic. You saw a lot of facilities shut down, capacity go away, and at the same time you had the potential need increase in certain states. So of the 5, I would say 2 were in that category that their gap actually went up. The other one of them had actually the gap declined, but that was primarily because the need declined more than the decline in the capacity itself. It was primarily just Maine and Wyoming that we've seen 2 states where both the need declined, but your capacity decline increased way more than the need decline. So actually the capacity increased. So this was the right trend that one wanted to see. So definitely kudos to Maine for what you're doing on that.
Thank you, Anubhav. Appreciate it. One more question for you, Linda, to kind of close out today. One of the things, of course, that you mentioned, and it's clear on our map here in Maine, that we have a higher gap, and this was consistent in 2020 as well, a higher gap in our second congressional district, which generally speaking is more rural than our first congressional district. And so in general, in the counties that you listed where we have more gap, versus others tend to be generally more rural as well. And then at the beginning of the conversation, you also talked about one of the national trends being that you're seeing some providers retire, and perhaps COVID hastened the retirement for some of those providers, certainly smaller providers. I'm wondering, are you seeing this, and as you talk to other states around the country, are you seeing this repeated in other states, particularly that may have this significant rural versus urban divide? Are you seeing some of the same things, and are you hearing that? Is that something you think is somewhat consistent, or is it a little too early to tell?
I do think it's early to tell, but and so most of what we know is anecdotal still. But we are definitely seeing a decline in the number of family child care providers. And I think that when we're concerned about this because, and I referenced our national survey work that we've been doing. We've been trying to understand what's going on with irregular hours of care, which is a real challenge for all of childcare in this country, but in rural areas in particular. And so we've really looked at that, and I think that's where family childcare picks up the greatest share of the capacity. And if we're losing family childcare providers, that's not good. So I think we need to think about that. It's interesting in some states are doing different things to address that. In one state I was in recently, they're actually giving a monthly stipend to family child care providers in addition to what they get for if they take one subsidy child, then they get a monthly stipend to help stabilize them and keep them in business. So there are states that are doing things to try and incentivize this. Todd, the other thing that you've given me the mic, and I'm going to take it here. The other thing that I think is important, and I hear it a lot, and it is a little frustrating when I hear it, is that you can't have childcare centers in rural areas because there's the economy of scale is not there. And then I go back to my own history. The first center that I opened in Montana was 25 children. Now, I will say to you and to anyone out there that it's more expensive to do that care than, a lot of people want to think, well, it's cheaper. It isn't cheaper, and it can be done. It just costs more to do it because you don't have the number of children to pay the overhead and all those things. So as you begin to look at your rural issues, I would caution you to look at things like, how do you look at your rates that you're paying to compensate for a smaller number of children? And I know sometimes that's counterintuitive to our general, constituency.
Well, great. That's great advice. We appreciate it very much. I want to thank you again, as well as Anubhav, for working with the state of Maine on this careful and thorough analysis. Just as we did in 2020, we're looking forward to using this data to help guide some of our decision making and some of our initiatives going forward. So thank you again for doing that. And for everyone who is watching this webinar, thank you for taking the time to learn more about the early care and education landscape in Maine, where our supply and demand numbers and analysis show us at right now, and where are some ideas on where we're going to go from here. We look forward to continuing to engage with all of you as we continue to make Maine a great place to live and grow and work. So thank you so much for being here today and being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again in the very near future.